Say it again, Carla said, giggling, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that cuts deeper than any shout. Say vegetables. You make it sound like a cartoon grandma. The room erupted in laughter, a chorus that wasn't really about humor but about power, about reminding me I was different, an outsider even at my own family's dinner table. They laughed at the way my accent softened the harsh consonants, the lilting melody I carried from a childhood spent far from here, from a language that wasn't quite English but had taught me resilience. I sat there with my hands folded on my lap, pretending the sharp sting of their mockery didn't settle deep in my chest. I was 81 years old then, a woman who had given everything to this family, who had dreamed of passing down stories and traditions, only to find myself silenced beneath polite smiles and cruel jokes. Now, I live with Joyce, my roommate, in a small apartment far from those crowded rooms filled with laughter that never included me. But back then, I still believed I had a place at that table, that my voice mattered, that my accent was part of my story, not a joke to be discarded. I was wrong. It wasn't always like this. For years I was the heart of our family gatherings, the one who brought the meals, the warmth, the stories wrapped in spices and memories. My kitchen was a refuge, my voice a bridge between generations. But the change crept in quietly, like fog rolling over a familiar landscape. The first time Carla teased my accent, it was with a smile, a joke tucked into a compliment about how charming I sounded. I laughed then, because I wanted to believe in kindness, in the love beneath those words. But the jokes grew sharper, more frequent, less hidden behind polite laughter. They began to invite others in, the grandchildren joining with whispered imitations behind their parents' backs, giggling in corners where I could not hear but felt. The way they said my name, slowly, exaggeratedly, like a character in a play no one invited me to watch. I noticed the way Daniel, my son, stopped asking about my health or my day, how his eyes darted away when I spoke, as if my words were inconvenient noise disrupting a carefully controlled symphony. Carla, once kind enough, now corrected my grammar at dinner, leaning in close with a look that said, "Let me fix this for you." The same woman who bragged about her bilingual skills would snicker when I ordered coffee, imitating the soft roll of my R's as if it were a joke. I felt the room shrink, my place erode, but I kept quiet, held my tongue, because that's what you do when you're a grandmother, especially one with an accent. The final blow came on a quiet evening that should have been ordinary. The house was filled with the smells of roast chicken and fresh bread, the clatter of dishes, the hum of small talk. I sat at the table, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my glass, when I caught a glance at Liam, my youngest grandson. His phone was tucked under the table, the screen lit with a message he was eagerly typing. Later, I learned what it was. An exchange with his mother, Carla, full of snide comments and laughter emojis. "She sounds like that woman who used to clean for us," one text read, followed by a string of exaggerated quotes mimicking my accent. The same room that held my family was now the stage for my humiliation, and I was the unwilling actor, forced to listen without a script. The air around me thickened, heavy with the unspoken truth that I was no longer the beloved matriarch, but a punchline, a shadow of my former self. That night, as the laughter echoed and the dishes were cleared, I made a silent vow that I would find my voice again, even if it meant speaking it alone. I'm not just a grandmother with an accent. I am a woman who built bridges with her words, who fought wars with kindness and patience, who raised children in a language that was not her own but became her strength. I have lived through the harshness of being othered, of being invisible in a world that prizes conformity over character. Now, at 81, I sit far from that dinner table, but the echoes of their laughter still ring in my ears. They tried to silence me, to erase the parts of me that didn't fit their picture of a perfect family. But what they don't know is that an accent is more than a sound. It's a story, a history. a legacy. It carries the weight of the places I've been, the people I've loved, and the battles I've survived. I carry it proudly, even if they cannot hear it with respect. I live quietly now with Joyce, who understands that silence can be both a refuge and a rebellion. We share mornings over coffee, afternoons reading books that whisper of other lives, other voices. Sometimes I hear the distant hum of a life I left behind. A life filled with faces that don't look like mine, with words that wound disguised as jokes. But I am here, and I am speaking. Not with the timidity they expected, but with a strength born from years of being overlooked, underestimated, and mocked. This is my story, and it begins with a voice that refused to be silenced, a voice shaped by an accent that tells the truth of survival. And if you listen closely, you will hear more than just the sound. You will hear the woman behind it, standing tall, ready to be heard at last. The night after that dinner, I lay awake in the quiet of my small bedroom, the weight of their laughter still pressing against my ribs like a heavy, invisible hand. It wasn't just the words. They were sharp, biting, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I realized then that something had shifted irrevocably. The family I had spent a lifetime building with my hands and heart had started to build walls around me instead. The next morning brought no relief. Instead, it brought the unmistakable clarity of betrayal that had been masked by smiles and forced politeness. I discovered the true depth of their contempt not through a loud confrontation, but through the cold, unfeeling glow of a screen. Carla had left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. A careless mistake, or perhaps a challenge. I could never tell. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but the pain of invisibility had clawed so deeply into me that I needed to see the truth laid bare. I picked it up, fingers trembling, and opened the messages she had sent and received over the past weeks. The conversations were full of mockery disguised as casual jokes, whispers of disdain that were meant to be hidden but were now glaring in bright pixels. They called me that woman, the accent lady, and made jokes about how I couldn't even pronounce the names of the vegetables correctly. But it wasn't just Carla. Daniel, my son, was there too, laughing at screenshots she sent him, adding cruel quips of his own. Their words spilled out like poison, shared among themselves as if I were a storybook character, a caricature to be laughed at, but never to be taken seriously. The messages were cold and calculated. Why does she even come to these dinners? She doesn't fit anymore, Carla wrote. Daniel replied, "It's for show. We keep her around to avoid guilt, but no one really listens to her." There was even a voice note where Carla mimicked my accent, elongating vowels and twisting words until they sounded absurd. The sound was enough to make my stomach turn, but what struck me most was the laughter in the background. My family, enjoying the mockery, sharing the moment as if it were a private joke at my expense. I felt as though the ground beneath me was crumbling. This wasn't a mistake or a bad day. This was a deliberate act of erasure. They were erasing me from the narrative of their lives, reducing me to a punchline so small I might as well vanish. Yet, I did not break. Instead of retreating into tears, I began copying their messages, word for word, onto a blank notebook I found in my room. The act was slow and deliberate. Each sentence was a stitch in the fabric of my resolve. By the time I had finished, the room was dark, the only sound my pen scratching across the paper. It was a strange comfort to hold their words in my own hand, to make their cruelty tangible and real instead of a vague, haunting whisper. I knew deep down that I would not remain silent forever. That night, as the house settled into uneasy sleep, I sat with the notebook open before me, reading their words aloud in the quiet. It was not a cry for justice or revenge, but a quiet reckoning. I was preparing to reclaim my voice, even if it trembled. The next family dinner came sooner than I expected. They had set the table with care. The white linen cloth pressed smooth and shining under the chandelier's glow. The air smelled of roasted meat and fresh herbs. The clinking of glasses mingled with soft music playing in the background. I arrived with the familiar dread knotting my stomach, but also with a new quiet strength nestled beneath my ribs. Carla greeted me with the same practiced smile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when I sat down. The grandchildren avoided my gaze, whispering in low tones, but no one dared speak to me with the same careless cruelty that had echoed through the messages. I could feel their discomfort, the fragile veneer of their control beginning to crack. As the evening unfolded, Daniel raised his glass to toast the perfect family, and the room hummed with forced cheer. Then, without hesitation, I began to read. I did not yell or accuse. I simply spoke their words, the text copied in my neat handwriting, one by one, aloud, clear and steady. The room fell silent. Faces paled. Carla's smile faltered. The laughter died in Daniel's throat. My grandchildren looked down at their plates, unable to meet my eyes. I read the voice notes, the cruel jabs, the dismissive comments about my accent and my presence. I read their cold indifference to the woman who had carried their childhoods on her shoulders. I did not speak beyond their words. I let their cruelty speak for itself. The power in that moment was mine, not because I shouted, but because I refused to let their words remain hidden or unchallenged. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. It was the sound of a family forced to confront the ugliness they had buried beneath laughter. I stood then, gathered my things calmly, and thanked them for the dinner. There was no apology, no explanation. I handed Daniel an envelope. Inside were documents I had prepared in secret, the revocation of a trust, the removal of their names from the deed to my home. It was not just a legal act, but a symbolic one. The house I had built memories in, the walls that had echoed with children's laughter and whispered prayers, would no longer be theirs. Instead, I had arranged for it to be donated to a shelter supporting immigrant women who, like me, had been made to feel invisible or unwelcome because of their voices, their accents, their histories. They never made fun of my voice when I asked for help, I said quietly. And with that, I left. No one followed me. No one called out. The door closed behind me like a final chord in a long, painful symphony. Outside, Joyce was waiting in her car. The night air was cool and smelled of rain. I slid into the passenger seat, feeling the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders. I was not sure where this new path would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from their laughter, free from their judgment, free to speak in my own voice, even if it carried an accent they chose to mock. The catalyst for my journey was not a single cruel word, but the culmination of years of small wounds that had piled up like stones in my chest. That night marked the moment I stopped shrinking, stopped hiding, and began to reclaim myself, not as the woman they mocked, but as the woman I had always been beneath their laughter. After the sharpness of betrayal, the subtle undermining began. It wasn't marked by a single event or a loud confrontation, but by the slow and deliberate shrinking of my presence in the family I had once nurtured with every ounce of love I had. The walls of that house, once warm and welcoming, grew colder each day. I could feel it in the way my son Daniel no longer looked at me directly when we spoke, his eyes flickering away as if my words were inconvenient sounds disrupting his carefully curated life. Carla, his wife, moved with an air of control that was almost surgical, her gestures precise, as if she were orchestrating a scene in which I was a mere background prop. I was invited to the dinners, but not to the conversations. I was served meals, but my suggestions for recipes were brushed aside with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. They asked me to speak slower, to fix my accent, and when I tried, the laughter returned, quiet but cutting. "Maybe an app could help, Mom," Daniel joked once, as if my voice was a glitch needing correction, not the melody of my life story. I began to notice the patterns, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way the grandchildren whispered just out of earshot, the silences that fell like curtains whenever I tried to share a memory. Carla started bringing friends over. Doctors, architects, people who didn't ask about my life or listen to my stories. Their eyes skimmed over me, assessing but never really seeing. The house itself was a testament to the life they wanted to show the world. Pristine marble countertops, carefully selected art, no photographs of Daniel as a boy, not a single picture including me. It was as if the past I represented was a stain they wanted to erase. One afternoon, I found a small gallery wall near the staircase. 6 framed photos hung in perfect alignment. Carla's family, her parents sailing in Rome, her children playing at the beach, but no hint of Daniel's childhood, no trace of me. The void was louder than any insult. It whispered that I belonged to a history they no longer acknowledged, a chapter they wanted closed. Their erasure wasn't just emotional, it became physical. My coat, an old navy wool that had once been a gift from Derek, was no longer hung with care. Instead, it was shoved into a narrow closet near the door, away from the hall closet full of designer jackets and polished shoes. When I asked about it, Carla responded distractedly, "We're doing gluten-free now, but the kids might want some," referring to the tin of scones I'd brought. It was a dismissal wrapped in casual words. I was welcome in the house, but not in their hearts. Daniel's children from his first marriage, whom I barely knew, barely acknowledged me, muttering quiet hellos before disappearing upstairs. My own granddaughter, the baby, slept in a sleek white bassinet that looked more like a gadget than a cradle. The family I had raised was there, but I was not. The loneliness was sharpest during those quiet mornings when I sat at the breakfast bar, sipping bitter coffee from a machine I didn't know how to operate. Carla was busy in the kitchen, blending fruit and yogurt with military precision, while Daniel scrolled endlessly through his phone. "We're heading out soon," Carla announced one morning, listing their plans with the detached efficiency of someone checking off items on a list. "Soccer for Nathan, a baby sensory class." "Maybe I'll take a walk," I offered quietly. Daniel glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're sure you're okay with that? It's a pretty upscale area. Just don't talk to anyone too long, okay?" There was no question in his voice, only a thinly veiled warning. Carla's sharp glance told me I was not just a guest, but a problem to be managed. In the silence that followed their departure, I wandered through the immaculate rooms that had once been my family's sanctuary. The kitchen counters gleamed, the fridge hummed with chilled green juices and protein bars, everything sterile, everything unfamiliar. I opened the door to the laundry room and found a cabinet filled with household paperwork. There, tucked on the top shelf, was a beige folder I recognized from the day Daniel had asked me to co-sign the mortgage. The closing summary, the mortgage documents, the legal ownership statement, all bearing my name, Marianne Cross, printed in full. For a moment I pressed the folder to my chest, remembering the sacrifices made, the years spent securing a future for this family. But now, the reality was clear. I was a stranger in my own home. Evenings were the hardest. I would sit quietly in the sparse guest room, staring at the blank walls and the small suitcase stand, feeling the weight of absence press in on me. The dinners became formal affairs, attended by Carla's carefully chosen friends, their laughter a sharp contrast to the cold distance I felt. They called me a longtime family friend, a euphemism that stripped away the years of love and sacrifice. At one such dinner, the guests admired the marble countertops and the curated art, never noticing the woman who had helped build the foundation beneath their feet. When I excused myself, Daniel followed me to the kitchen, his voice low and rehearsed. "Carla has a certain style, Mom," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's efficient. It's not that we don't appreciate everything you've done, but this house, It's part of a life we're building. Maybe it's best if you don't mention the deed." His words hit me harder than any accusation. "I never wanted credit," I said quietly. "I wanted connection." He shifted, uncomfortable, and walked away. The days blurred together in a haze of polite neglect and unspoken resentments. I found small ways to assert myself: a cup of coffee made just right, a quiet walk around the neighborhood to stretch my legs. But the feeling of invisibility lingered. My voice was reduced to a whisper, my presence to a shadow. Yet amidst the coldness, small moments of warmth appeared. Heather, the woman who ran the cafe where I began working, offered a cinnamon roll with no strings attached. Arthur, a regular customer, asked about birds and listened without judgment. Joyce, my roommate, didn't ask questions she didn't want answers to. Slowly, I began to stitch together a new rhythm, one that wasn't defined by my family's indifference, but by the steady pulse of my own choices. The first paycheck I earned felt like a small rebellion. Money that belonged only to me, unmarked by guilt or obligation. I walked into a secondhand store and bought myself a coat, not because I needed it, but because I deserved it. Each thread was a declaration. I was still here, still capable of choosing for myself. The coat fit like a shield, a warm armor against the coldness of rejection. Night after night, I read and reflected, learning to love the silence that was no longer filled with the sound of being dismissed. The phone remained off most days, a conscious choice to disconnect from the world that had made me feel so small. Occasionally, a letter would arrive. Words from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, who still remembered me, who still wanted me in his life. His letters were lifelines, quiet affirmations that not all bridges were burned. But I didn't rush back. I needed time to breathe, to reclaim my story, to rewrite my place in the world on my own terms. Each day was a small step away from the family that had sidelined me and a step toward a life rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. The first escalation wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by the slow accumulation of these quiet acts. Refusing to be invisible, refusing to be silenced, and finding strength in the small spaces where respect and kindness could grow. The journey was far from over, but in the spaces between their absence and my presence, I was beginning to find myself again. There came a moment when the weight of silence I had carried for so long began to shift beneath me, subtle as the dawn breaking after a long night. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a dramatic scene. It was quieter, more profound. I found myself waking one morning with a new resolve nestled like a seed deep inside my chest, one that promised growth, change, and a reclaiming of the life I thought had slipped irretrievably through my fingers. The loneliness I once feared began to feel less like a prison and more like a space, empty, and waiting for something new to take root. I realized then that I was no longer bound by the roles they had assigned me: mother, grandmother, a shadow in the background. I could redefine who I was, on my own terms. The first step was practical. I needed a home, a place that wasn't just four walls, but a refuge where I could breathe without feeling watched or judged. Joyce, my roommate, was an unlikely ally. She was gruff, guarded, but in her way, she understood the necessity of space, both physical and emotional. When I told her I wanted to find a room of my own, she didn't ask why. She just handed me a flyer from the community board, a simple note about a quiet lady wanted to share a house. No nonsense, no drama. It felt like an invitation crafted just for me, a chance to step into a new chapter without the weight of expectation. I called the number. A woman answered with a raspy voice, skeptical but not unkind. When she asked if I was clean, I laughed softly. "Not in a long time," I said. The woman laughed back. "Come by at 4, she said, and that was how I met Joyce. Her house was nothing like the polished home I'd left behind. It smelled of lavender and fried onions, of lived-in comfort rather than curated perfection. Joyce smoked, cursed softly under her breath, and welcomed me with a cigarette in one hand and a cat curled around her ankles. She didn't mince words. "You the old lady?" she asked bluntly. I nodded and she stepped aside. "Come in then. Let's see if we can tolerate each other." There was no pretense between us, just two women who had lived long enough to know that survival often meant choosing your battles carefully. The room she offered was small but filled with light, and when the afternoon sun poured in through the window, it felt like a promise. I unpacked my few belongings: 3 changes of clothes, an old paperback novel, my medications, and for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The next morning, I walked to a nearby cafe where Heather worked, a woman who saw more than just an elderly waitress. Heather gave me a trial shift, and against all odds, I found rhythm in the rush of orders, the clatter of dishes, the steam rising from the coffee pots. The work was honest and simple, a stark contrast to the complicated silence I'd left behind. My hands, once trembling from years of neglect, learned to steady again as I poured coffee, smiled at strangers, and found purpose in service. Heather didn't ask about my past or my family. She just offered an apron and a nod of acceptance. The first paycheck I earned was small, but it was mine. I walked to a secondhand store and bought a navy wool coat, a small act of defiance and self-respect. That coat became my armor, a symbol of a woman who was reclaiming her dignity stitch by stitch. At Joyce's house, life unfolded in quiet routines. We ate frozen pot pies, watched the news without sound, and shared the silence that only years of companionship can fill. She didn't ask me to explain myself, and I didn't offer. Instead, we found solace in small acts: shelled peas in the kitchen, cups of coffee sipped on the porch, the steady presence of Franklin, the cat who chose us both. The neighborhood began to feel less foreign with each passing day. I found comfort in the scent of lilacs, the sound of birdsong, the sight of Arthur at the cafe, a man whose quiet kindness reminded me that connection was still possible. Arthur didn't pry or judge. He simply listened, and in his company, I learned to listen to myself again. Letters arrived from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the one who never stopped believing I mattered. His words were a balm to the wounds left by silence and exclusion. We began to rebuild a fragile bridge, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. When I finally answered his call, the sound of his voice was a gentle reminder that family could be more than the pain I'd endured. We didn't rush to fill the spaces with promises or apologies. Instead, we let the quiet grow between us, a new foundation for what might come next. In this new life, I discovered something I had long forgotten: freedom. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the simple act of choosing when to speak and when to listen, when to hold on and when to let go. The phone remained off most days, a deliberate choice to protect the fragile peace I had found. I spent evenings reading by lamplight, the soft pages of books, a comfort that no family gathering had ever offered. I began to write letters, not to those who had abandoned me, but to myself. Words of kindness and encouragement, reminders that I was enough, that my voice mattered even if no one else heard it. The transformation was not without its shadows. The past still lingered at the edges. Letters from Adam, the lawyer's cold visit, the news clipping that painted me as a missing matriarch rather than a woman who chose to walk away. But I faced these reminders with a steady heart. I refused to let them define me. Instead, I embraced the new rhythms of my life: the work, the friendships, the quiet moments of joy. I baked lemon squares for the community potluck, laughing with Joyce as we carried them to a basement filled with strangers who welcomed me without question. I stood by the coffee station, feeling for the first time in years that I belonged somewhere, not because of blood, but because of who I was. This was no longer a story of loss, but of beginning. I was no longer waiting for someone to save me, or for a family to recognize my worth. I was the author of my own story, writing each day with courage and grace. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew that I was walking it on my own terms, in my own voice, free at last. The fragile peace I had begun to build was soon tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. Just as I was beginning to feel the edges of a new life soften, the past reached out to pull me back into its cold grasp. It came not with the gentle knock of a visitor, but like a storm rolling in, relentless and impossible to ignore. The letter arrived first, a thick envelope, unfamiliar handwriting looping with a mixture of anger and desperation. It was from Adam, my son, the man who had once assured me that everything would be different, that our family would always stand together. The words inside were sharp and unyielding, an accusation masquerading as concern. "I can't believe you did this," he wrote, his pen dripping with frustration and disbelief. He complained of stress, confusion, and the supposed pain I had caused by leaving. Lisa's tears were mentioned, the children's bewilderment, and a plea for me to be reasonable. It was a performance, a carefully crafted script meant to shame me into submission, to guilt me back into the role of the obedient mother who never caused waves. But I had already learned that their version of concern was a mask for control. I folded the letter slowly, letting the weight of their expectations settle beneath the edges of my resolve. I didn't respond. Silence was my shield. Yet the letter marked a turning point, a reminder that the family I'd left behind was not willing to let go without a fight. Days later, a newspaper clipping arrived, slipped discreetly under my door by Joyce. It was an article from the local paper, featuring a photo of me smiling at a family gathering long past. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family speaks out on grandmother's disappearance." Adam's voice echoed through the printed words, painting me as vulnerable, lost, a woman who had vanished without warning. Lisa's quote called me fragile, a person who might be in danger, someone who needed to be found and cared for. The cruelty of their performance struck me harder than any insult. They cast themselves as victims while erasing the years I had spent building a life of care and sacrifice. They wanted the story to be about their pain, not mine. The next morning, Heather at the cafe pulled me aside, her eyes full of quiet sympathy. "You okay?" she asked, placing a hand briefly on my arm. I nodded, but I felt the weight of their watchful eyes closing in. It wasn't just the letters or the articles. It was the subtle encroachment of their presence into my new world. Then Lisa herself appeared, stepping into the cafe with the polished grace I had once admired, but now found suffocating. Heather spotted her first, a woman standing stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read a chalkboard menu. Lisa didn't come to speak to me directly at first. She lingered in the shadows, as if testing the waters. When she finally approached, her voice was low, almost hesitant. "Martha," she said, using my given name with a strange mix of familiarity and distance. "Can we talk?" I nodded toward the back booth, and we sat facing each other in the quiet hum of the nearly empty cafe. She explained that Adam had sent a lawyer to check on me, that the family was worried, that the children missed me. Her eyes flickered with something like regret, but I had learned to see through such expressions. "We panicked," she admitted, but her voice was tight. "We thought you were behind us, and then you disappeared." I listened, the years of hurt and dismissal settling between us like a thick fog. 8 hours, Lisa," I said quietly. 8 hours in an airport lounge, waiting while you boarded without me. You didn't call, you didn't check, you left me. She looked down, the perfect manicure trembling slightly. "I didn't think you'd leave," she whispered. "But I did," I said firmly. "You left me behind." The silence stretched between us, taut and fragile. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "It's for Kieran," she said. He's struggling. He misses you. I took the envelope, not because I wanted what was inside, but to deny her the satisfaction of refusal. The gesture was a reminder that I still held the power to choose who I welcomed and who I shut out. He doesn't need a go-between, I said. He knows how to call. Lisa nodded, the woman I had once known replaced by someone smaller, wearier. I wasn't trying to replace you, she confessed. I just didn't want your shadow in every room. Her honesty was a shard of truth in the tangled web of our fractured family. That day marked the beginning of a new battle, one fought not with words, but with boundaries. The lawyer, Derek Sorensen, appeared soon after, a man with polished shoes and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He spoke carefully about concern and well-being, about ensuring I was in a safe environment, a phrase that felt like a cage disguised as care. I told him firmly that I was not a pet to be watched or a child to be controlled. I was a woman of sound mind, standing on her own feet, and no one had the right to dictate my life. The lawyer left with a promise to relay my message to Adam and Lisa, but I knew the fight was far from over. Amidst the turmoil, I found solace in unexpected places. Arthur, the widower who frequented the cafe, became a quiet companion in my storm. He never asked about my family or my past. Instead, he shared stories about birds, about cardinals and finches, about the surprising intelligence of crows. His presence was steady, a reminder that connection could exist without demands or judgment. Joyce, too, remained my anchor, offering companionship without questions, support without conditions. In their company, I learned that strength could be quiet, resilience could be soft, and healing was a journey, not a destination. Yet, the letters from Kieran were a lifeline that tugged at my heart. His words were gentle reminders that not all bonds were broken, that love could survive even the deepest wounds. When he called, I answered, and his voice cracked with emotion I hadn't heard before. We spoke of small things, books he was reading, the new job he'd started, the way freedom felt when no one was watching. There were no promises, no apologies, just the sound of a boy who still needed his grandmother and a woman who still wanted to be needed. The fragility of our connection was a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler, and the rhythm of my new life steadied. I baked lemon squares for a community potluck, laughing with Joyce as we carried them to a basement filled with strangers who welcomed me without question. I began to find joy in the ordinary, in the smell of cinnamon in the kitchen, the warmth of a shared meal, the soft glow of lamplight on pages worn by time. The world outside my family's reach was vast and unpredictable, but it was mine to explore. Still, the past never fully released its grip. Letters from Adam continued to arrive, each one a thinly veiled attempt to pull me back into the roles I had rejected. The local news kept the story alive, framing me as a missing person rather than a woman who had chosen her own path. The weight of their narrative pressed down on me, but I refused to let it define my truth. I wrote letters in return, not to answer their demands, but to assert my presence, my boundaries, my dignity. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the woman I had become. No longer the shadow at the dinner table, no longer the punchline to their cruel jokes. I was a woman who had faced rejection and found strength, who had lost a family, but gained herself. The journey was far from over, but with each step, I reclaimed a little more of the life that was always mine to claim. The day I decided to reclaim my power was not marked by anger or outburst, but by a quiet certainty that settled in my bones like a long-awaited homecoming. I had spent years bending to others' expectations, softening my edges to fit the spaces they provided, shrinking my voice until it was barely more than a whisper. But that morning, as sunlight spilled through the window and dust motes danced like tiny specters of the past, I felt a new resolve rise in me, a determination to speak my truth fully, on my own terms, and to do so in a way they could no longer ignore or dismiss. I knew this would be the moment that changed everything, not just for me, but for the family who had tried to erase me. The invitation to that dinner came as usual, with Carla's practiced smile and Daniel's distracted nod. The house was impeccably arranged, the table set with fine china and crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier's glow. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary and citrus, the kind of evening designed for appearances and polite conversation. I walked in with my navy wool coat draped over my arm, feeling the weight of it not as a burden but as armor. The laughter greeted me like a wave I had learned to surf, calm on the surface, turbulent underneath. As I took my seat at the table, the usual choreography unfolded. Carla whispering last-minute instructions, Daniel smoothly directing the conversation, the grandchildren alternating between whispers and forced smiles. The room was a stage, and I was the reluctant actress playing a part written for me long ago. But this time, I held in my hands not silence, but a notebook filled with the words they thought they had hidden away. I carried their cruelty etched in ink, their mockery transcribed line by line, ready to be heard not as jokes, but as truth. When Daniel raised his glass for a toast to family and new beginnings, I interrupted, not with anger, but with calm, deliberate clarity. I opened my notebook and began to read aloud. The words were sharp and cold, each sentence a mirror reflecting the ugliness they had tried to hide behind smiles and polite laughter. I read their texts, their voice notes, their secret jokes, the ways they had dismissed me as the accent lady, the shadow, the old family friend. The room grew silent. Glasses paused mid-air, forks froze halfway to mouths, eyes widened in disbelief. Carla's smile faltered, Daniel's throat tightened, and the grandchildren shrank into their seats, no longer able to hide behind youthful innocence. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I read every word slowly and clearly, because this was not just about exposing them, it was about reclaiming my story. The power in that moment was mine, because I chose how to speak, what to reveal, and when to stop. I let the silence that followed their own words settle like a heavy fog, thick and impossible to ignore. I saw the cracks in their carefully constructed facade, the discomfort they had always hidden from me. After I closed the notebook, I stood, steady and sure. I thanked them for the dinner, not as a gesture of submission, but as a formal closure. I handed Daniel an envelope I had prepared in secret, its contents carefully arranged to sever the ties they had once held over me. Inside was the documentation revoking the trust that had named them as beneficiaries of my home, the house that held decades of memories and the weight of sacrifices they never acknowledged. Instead, I had arranged for it to be donated to a shelter for immigrant women, those whose voices were often silenced, whose stories were often ignored. They never made fun of my voice when I asked for help, I said quietly, the words carrying the strength of years of endurance. The room was frozen in shock. No one spoke. No one moved. The door closed behind me like a seal, a final chord in a symphony of reclaiming. Outside, Joyce waited in her car, her presence a steady reassurance that I was not alone in this new chapter. The night air was crisp and smelled of rain. As I slid into the passenger seat, I felt a release, a lifting of burdens I hadn't known I carried. I was free, not because I had taken something from them, but because I had chosen myself. In the days that followed, the silence from my family was deafening. No calls, no messages, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if I had vanished from their world, erased once again, but this time on my own terms. I did not mourn their absence. I celebrated my presence. I poured myself real coffee, not the bitter, thin kind they had always tolerated. I walked in my new coat through streets that no longer felt foreign, greeting neighbors who knew nothing of the past, but welcomed me nonetheless. I wrote letters, not to explain, not to beg, but to affirm. To Kieran, I wrote of safety and hope, inviting him to meet me when the time was right, on my terms. To Lisa, a brief note acknowledging the past, but closing the door firmly. To Adam's lawyer, a clear declaration of independence and boundaries, a warning against further intrusion. Each letter was a thread weaving a new tapestry of my life, one of dignity, strength, and self-respect. The hardest part was not the confrontation itself, but the quiet moments afterward, the mornings spent alone with a book, the evenings on the porch with Joyce and Franklin, the feeling of being whole in a way I had not known for decades. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden. It was a slow unfolding, a reclaiming of identity piece by piece. I was no longer the grandmother who had been mocked, sidelined, and forgotten. I was a woman who had spoken her truth, who had set boundaries, who had chosen freedom over fear. Looking back, I realized that the climax was not the act of reading their texts aloud or revoking the trust. It was the moment I chose to stand fully in my own power, to refuse the roles assigned to me, and to step into the unknown with courage. It was the moment I embraced the voice I had been silenced for so long, and in doing so, found myself again. The quiet that followed the storm was not empty. It was filled with a new kind of peace, the kind that comes not from forgetting or forgiving too quickly, but from finally being seen, truly seen, by oneself. After years of carrying the weight of rejection and invisibility, I found myself sitting on the porch of Joyce's house, wrapped in an old quilt against the chill of the evening air, watching the moon rise slowly, round and luminous against the dark sky. Franklin the cat, curled up in my lap, his steady purring a reminder that life continues even when it feels like everything else has changed. In that stillness, I realized that I had come full circle, not back to where I started, but forward to a place I never dared to imagine. For so long, I had waited for someone to acknowledge my pain, to invite me back, to say the words I longed to hear. But waiting had only deepened the silence. It was only when I stopped waiting, when I chose myself instead, that I found the strength to rebuild. The house I had left behind was no longer mine, but the life I was creating was. It was messy and imperfect and sometimes lonely, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. I was no longer defined by their laughter or their absence, but by the quiet dignity I claimed in each small moment. The days settled into a new rhythm, mornings at the cafe, afternoons walking the neighborhood, evenings spent writing letters that I might never send, but that helped me make sense of the past. I baked lemon squares for community potlucks, laughing with strangers who didn't know my story but welcomed me anyway. I learned to find joy in ordinary things: the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a shared meal, the kindness of neighbors who became friends. In these moments, I discovered a truth that had been buried beneath years of hurt. I was not alone, and I was not invisible. My relationship with Kieran, my oldest grandchild, grew in its own quiet way. Our conversations were gentle, without pressure or expectation. He came to visit, sometimes alone, sometimes not, but always with the respect and love I had missed for so long. We did not rush to fill the spaces left by absence, but allowed our connection to grow slowly, like a tender shoot breaking through hard earth. He reminded me that family could be redefined, that bonds could be repaired without forgetting the pain. Our moments together were a sanctuary, a place where I could be both grandmother and woman, loved and respected for all that I was. I wrote a letter to myself one night, a letter I keep tucked away in my dresser drawer. In it, I reminded myself that waiting for others to save me was never the answer, that I had always held the key to my own freedom. You didn't lose them, I wrote. They let go. And you finally let go back. Those words were a balm, a closing of a chapter filled with sorrow and a gentle opening to a future filled with possibility. They remind me daily that I am enough, that my voice matters, and that my story is worth telling. Joyce and I often sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sharing the silence that speaks louder than words. She once asked me, "Are you still hiding or healing?" I smiled and said, "Both." Healing is not a straight path, but a winding road filled with moments of retreat and advance, of quiet reflection and bold steps forward. I have learned to embrace the complexity of this journey, to honor the pain while celebrating the strength it has forged. I am no longer the woman who was mocked for her accent, dismissed as a shadow, or erased from family photographs. I am a woman who has faced rejection and found resilience, who has reclaimed her voice and her life. My story is one of survival and transformation, of breaking free from the silence imposed by others to speak with a voice that is uniquely my own. I tell it not to seek sympathy, but to offer hope to those who may still be trapped in the shadows, to remind them that it is never too late to choose themselves. If you find yourself in a place of invisibility or pain, know that your voice matters, your story matters. You are not alone, and there is a life waiting for you beyond the silence. You do not need permission to be heard or to live fully. Be your own sign in the silence. Take the first step and keep walking. When you do, come back and tell me. I will be here listening, ready to welcome you into the light.